The final civil war of the Roman Republic, which took place between Octavian and Mark Antony, is widely regarded as a significant turning point in Rome's history. This conflict definitely ended the reign of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, while simultaneously establishing Octavian as the sole leader of Rome. Today's video will focus on that topic. The naval battle that occurred at Actium was particularly catastrophic for a significant leader. Mark Antony and his mistress, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra, began the battle with a formidable fleet of over 290 ships. However, they suffered a crushing defeat, losing over 200 ships, and were ultimately forced to flee in humiliation. To compound their troubles, many of Antony's commanders opted to surrender to the youthful general Octavian instead of persisting in their defense of Antony's cause. In spite of returning to Alexandria with nothing but humiliation, Antony and Cleopatra had no intention of surrendering. This forced Octavian to pursue them and defeat their greatest enemies once and for all. Despite his eagerness to dispatch troops to Egypt promptly, Octavian was disheartened and frustrated to find out that his plans had to be delayed due to internal issues within his legions. It was discovered that many of Octavian's most skilled and experienced soldiers were veterans who had previously fought in various wars and battles under the leadership of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. To make things clearer, a significant number of them had been engaged in fighting for over 20 years without any breaks. While achieving a historic and resounding victory at Actium, these men decided to collect what they believed to be their rightful possessions. Approximately 10 legions of soldiers requested an honorable discharge from the army, and a generous sum of money from Octavian to support their retirement. Octavian was concerned about losing the loyalty of many men if he treated the loyal warriors poorly. As a result, he had to comply with the wishes of the majority of the older legions who made a request. This allowed him to end their time in the army. After successfully resolving the issue with his men, Octavian eagerly awaited the end of winter and instructed his troops to prepare for battle against Antony once again. However, this time, the clash would take place in Alexandria, far from their current location. Nevertheless, Octavian was aware that he required a meticulously crafted strategy to pursue his adversary, even if it meant sacrificing all that he had worked tirelessly to achieve in the past few years. The most apparent strategy was to deploy his troops on boats and leverage his formidable navy to obliterate Alexandria. However, Octavian dismissed this strategy, since he realized that relying solely on naval tactics would not be sufficient to vanquish Antony and his staunch supporters permanently. Octavian was aware that numerous puppet kingdoms in Asia remained faithful to Mark Antony, and had even provided military support during several of his campaigns. He realized that, in order to completely eliminate any opposition against him, he needed to do more than just defeat Antony in Alexandria. He also needed to regain control of the puppet kingdoms. Due to various circumstances, in the spring of 30 BC, Octavian made the decision to abandon his initial plan of attacking Antony by sea. Instead, he determined that a more effective strategy, albeit a lengthier one, would be to send his troops through Asia by land. The plan turned out to be very wise. As his powerful army marched to find Mark Antony and Cleopatra, he prevented his enemy from regrouping the troops loyal to him in the area. This made it impossible for the general to maintain control over them. As the virtually unstoppable march was underway, Mark Antony made preparations to defend himself. Nonetheless, his situation was quite challenging. Following his catastrophic defeat at Actium, Antony made the imprudent decision to retain the majority of his troops in Greece. The army was truly remarkable, comprising of 23 legions and over 15,000 cavalry. In most situations, they were capable of defeating any other military force in the world. However, this particular scenario was an exception. The formidable army soon depleted their essential supplies, rendering them unable to engage in combat effectively. As a result, they surrendered, leading to Antony's loss of many valuable men. Despite the unfavorable situation, Antony had some influential supporters who could help him. Lucius Panarius was one of the rulers of Cyrenaica, a region of Libya. Antony could pose a significant threat to Octavian with the support of Lucius's troops. However, the actual outcome was different from what was expected. Upon realizing that Octavian was likely to emerge victorious over Mark Antony, Pinarius made the strategic decision to switch alliance and align himself with Octavian, instead of remaining loyal to the once triumphant Roman general, Mark Antony. Upon discovering that his valuable ally had switched to his side, Octavian issued orders for Lucius Pinarius to engage large-scale movements. A decision was made to send 4 legions under the command of Lucius to move towards the east of Alexandria, while the troops under the command of Octavian would approach from the west. After discovering Pinarius' betrayal, Antony and Cleopatra readied themselves for a final battle, realizing that their chances of fleeing, as they had previously done at Actium, were now slim to none. Octavian's troops, along with most of Pinarius' forces, swiftly arrived in Alexandria and began to besiege the city without delay. Octavian had yet arrived at the battlefield, causing Antony to believe that the best course of action would be to engage Lucius' troops, assuming they were a smaller force. Antony believed that if the plan succeeded, they could withstand Octavian's forces for a long period of time. Without Pinarius' assistance, Octavian's forces would be a more manageable opponent. Antony instructed nearly all of the remaining 30,000 men under his command to prepare for an attack on Pinarius' troops. After assembling the military, they were ordered to advance and destroy Lucius' men to keep the hope of victory alive, even if it was faint. Unfortunately, the plan did not go as intended. Antony's troops made the mistake of greatly underestimating their adversary. As a result, they found themselves facing a much more prepared and larger enemy force than they had anticipated. According to some historians, Pinarius had a numerical advantage of over 10,000 men compared to Mark Antony. However, there are others who argue that Pinarius' lead was even more significant, with Lucius commanding up to twice the number of soldiers as his opponent. Despite the disastrous and bleak scenario, Antony refused to surrender. The events that ensued were a gruesome and dreadful battle, during which Antony made the futile attempts to fending off the opposing army. Despite the courage of his men and his strong leadership, Pinarius' numerical advantage made it nearly impossible for them to overcome Lucius' army. Even the soldiers who were initially hesitant were motivated to advance freely under his command. Antony's forces quickly declined and the enemy suffered significant losses during the prolonged fighting. Despite this, Antony refused to retreat. After a prolonged period of violence, Antony's troops ultimately surrendered, and Pinarius' soldiers nearly wiped out his entire army. Upon realizing that Octavian had not yet arrived, Mark Antony grew anxious and desperate. He feared being captured by his most formidable adversary and fled the battlefield, returning to Alexandria. Following the event, a small group of men persisted in their battle against Pinarius. However, they realized that achieving victory was not possible, especially with Octavian's imminent arrival. As a result, the remaining soldiers and cavalry of Mark Antony's army opted to surrender. The sense of defeat against Lucius and Octavian was so overwhelming that even troops who were not directly engaged in the battle chose to surrender without attempting to fight. On August 1st, 30 BC, Mark Antony was devastated by his defeat and the news of Cleopatra's suicide. After fighting for so many years, he saw everything he had worked for crumble before his eyes, and this caused him to suffer a mental breakdown. The overwhelming situation caused the general to lose the will to live. In a moment of great despair, he asked his loyal personal assistant to end his suffering by killing him with a sword. Nevertheless, his assistant was unable to fulfill this order, which resulted in him choosing to take his own life instead of going against his masters. Mark Antony found himself in a state of complete desolation with limited options. As a result, he positioned his sword and quickly fell upon it, taking his own life. His attempt to take his own life by falling on his sword resulted in a severe wound in his stomach, but it was not fatal. Antony was rescued by his friends and later found out that Cleopatra was still alive, concealed in her mausoleum. Plutarch recounts that, during their final meeting, he informed his beloved that he was dying with honor. He also assured the queen that she could rely on Gaius Proculius, a member of Octavian's entourage. It is interesting to note that he was also the one who successfully infiltrated the queen's mausoleum using a ladder, thereby preventing the destruction of her valuable possessions. Despite being taken prisoner, she was permitted to perform proper funeral rites for Antony's corpse. Octavian's path to victory was clear now that Mark Antony had died and Cleopatra had been captured. He entered Alexandria triumphantly and swiftly took over the palace. He then ordered the arrest of Cleopatra's 3 youngest sons. The Egyptian queen was escorted to meet Octavian in an attempt to negotiate a possible agreement with him. During the meeting, she pleaded with him to spare her son Caesarion, who was born as a result of her relationship with Julius Caesar. Octavian showed no interest in fulfilling any of Cleopatra's desires. He provided minimal details about his intentions for her and her family, simply stating that she would be spared. After a few days, a spy informed the queen that Octavian had intentions of sending her to Rome solely for the purpose of parading her humiliatingly in a grand triumph to celebrate his victory in Egypt. According to the historian Titus Livius, the queen reportedly spoke the following words: "I will not be triumphed over." She was determined and decided that if she could not control how she lived, she would at least control how she died. According to the historian Strabo, Cleopatra's death was caused by a snake bite, which was likely carried out by a member of her court on August 10, 30 BC. Meanwhile, Plutarch reports that Arrius Didymus, a teacher and advisor to Octavian, suggested to Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, that it would be unwise to keep him alive, as he could pose a threat to Octavian's government. Octavian followed this advice and ordered Caesarion's execution in August of the same year. Despite the trouble that Cleopatra and Mark Antony had caused him, Octavian showed great respect for Cleopatra's courage and ordered an opulent funeral for the 2 lovers in Rome. The burial of Mark Antony was grand, with certain legions that had once been under his command allowed to march beside the tomb. Octavian, the Egyptian general and queen's conqueror, ordered a day of mourning in their honor. However, Octavian's actions were not solely driven by admiration or goodwill towards his defeated enemies. As a skilled politician, he knew that humiliating his dead adversaries would not be welcomed by many of the Roman people and elite. Consequently, he took great care to be seen as a benevolent man who respected even his mortal enemies, proving to be a wise and insightful political maneuver. Despite his victory, Octavian remained vigilant, knowing that another enemy could arise at any moment. Nevertheless, he accepted every possible honor, elated by his conquest of Egypt. He was honored with the post of pharaoh about a month after defeating Antony and Cleopatra. This made Egypt practically a possession of his, and he also gained control of its vast riches. After returning to Rome, he was determined to consolidate his power to avoid suffering the same fate as Julius Caesar. Octavian, despite his youth, did not rush to consolidate power to prevent the advance of opposing forces. Many others took this approach, but Octavian was more patient and deliberate. He consolidated his positions gradually, accepting powers and honors without much attention, and eliminating Antony's remaining supporters. After a few months, he achieved a significant political victory with the help of his loyal ally Agrippa. He convinced the Senate to grant him command of Gaul, Spain, and Syria, which gave him complete authority over half of the territories governed by Rome. In a brief period, he acquired all the power, but in 27 BC, he made a surprising decision that caught everyone in Rome off guard. Without prior notice, he announced to the Senate that he was relinquishing his esteemed positions, authority, and above all, retiring from public office. At that time, only Octavian's closest allies, including the faithful Agrippa, comprehended the motives behind his actions. But it was perplexing to most people why Octavian, who had fought so hard for so many years and was at the pinnacle of his success, would relinquish everything he had worked for. Although this decision may appear unreasonable at first glance, it ultimately enabled Octavian to secure absolute power, establish his legacy, and assume the title of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Augustus not only sought revenge for his adopted father, but also established a powerful legacy that lasted for centuries, surpassing even Caesar's wildest aspirations. Augustus's rule was so influential and competent that historians still refer to it as the golden age of the Roman Empire. No other emperor has been able to surpass his achievements, making Augustus one of the most significant figures in the history of Rome and all of human history. If you enjoyed watching this video, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.